Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a nice turnout, and I think that says a lot for Vim's reputation and his status in this group. Vim is known for quite brutal rewrites of his juniors' heads of arguments. So we thought we would bring him in to maybe help us avoid that humbling experience. Incidentally, I was once the beneficiary of some second-hand drafting advice from Vim, which was actually given to me by Kate, but she said that Vim had passed it on to her at some stage. And it was something very simple, but something that almost immediately improved my heads of argument, and something that I still bear in mind every time I'm drafting heads. But I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'll save that for the end, in case he doesn't address it in his own presentation. But Vim, please do your thing, and once you are finished, we'll take questions and have a discussion.
Thank you very much. Where do you want me to stand?
I think exactly where you are, actually.
Oh, good.
Okay. You can come a little bit more central.
No, yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to speak to you. And we actually have a wonderful group, and it's so nice to do something like this. When one starts off talking about heads of argument, you have to ask yourself what the purpose is of heads of argument. But it really takes one back, I think, to something far more fundamental that took me more than a decade to realize when I came to the bar. And that is that our job as an advocate, our brief, the thing we get paid for, is to persuade the judge. It's so obvious, but it was never clear to me that was the objective that should drive everything that we do, is to persuade the judge. I always assumed, probably because I come from Pretoria, that if you work really hard and you find what you think is the right answer and you present that to the court, then you'll win the case. But that is not so. Sometimes judges are persuaded by all sorts of things. And remember, your client employs you because she wants victory, not justice or whatever, the right answer. Client wants victory, and you're employed within the rules of, ethical rules of course. Your mandate is to win the case, and you can only win the case not to be right, not to be clever, not to be eloquent, but by persuading the judge. That is the most important lodestar that you have to bear in mind, that determines everything else that you do. Let me tell you how not to do it. I had a case before the SCA, Senbes, something like that, where I had to argue an appeal that a suite of contracts was not a sham. And I thought I had a very clever argument that this was not a sham. And I barely started when Judge Haram said to me, but listen, Mr. Trengove, isn't this the worst sham that you've ever seen in your life? Have you ever seen a worse sham than this? So 10 minutes into the appeal, the presiding judge and I were debating whether we'd ever seen a worse sham than the one before. Now that was a case of not persuading the judge. It didn't help that I had a clever argument. The purpose of the exercise is to persuade the judge, not to persuade a generic judge. Persuade a particular judge. You attune your arguments, everything that you do, to the persuasion of a particular judge. That is also why an academic article or an essay or a moot presentation would be different. Your job as an advocate is to persuade a particular judge. Now, how to do it? As I say, not the way I did it in Senbes, but the most important, most helpful indicator of how to persuade a judge is firstly to persuade the judge to want to find for you for whatever reason, and then secondly to show the judge how that can be done. Let me tell you about an extreme example of that case. I once heard Edwin Cameron complain that George Bezos had appeared before him in a case about the eviction of hundreds of people in the mid of winter who would then have no shelter. But the case turned on a law point on which there were conflicting judgments, a very interesting, very complex law point. And Edwin was keen to hear from George what his submissions were on this law point. But George went on about the mothers and the children and the grandmothers in the cold, in the middle of winter, and the disease and the poverty and the sickness. And Edwin said he couldn't wait for George to get beyond it and to get to the low point. And George went on about the mothers and the children and the grandmothers. And when he eventually got to the end of it, he said, "You know, your lordship will do the right thing." And he said, but the joke was on Edwin, because ultimately Edwin found for George. And that is because George, the consummate advocate that he was, knew very well that if he could persuade Edwin to want to find for his clients, Edwin was clever enough to find a way to do it. No, I'm not suggesting that you would always win your cases by merely persuading the court that you have justice on your side. But if you can persuade the judge to want to find for you, then it is usually reasonably easy to persuade the judge how to do it. And remember that want to find for you. That is really something. That's really an issue that turns on the facts of the case. And it takes me to another aspect that I want to emphasize. If there are two mistakes that inexperienced advocates make more than any other, then it is that they underestimate the importance of the facts, and secondly, that they overestimate the importance of sort of general law on the topic that they discuss. But underestimation of the facts. You know, one of the best advocates, probably one of the, if not the best, one of the three best advocates that I've ever come across and ever worked with was Johan Trengove, who won extraordinary cases. The hallmark of a really good advocate is that they win bad cases. Johan often won bad cases. But you won't ever see that Johan made big law like Arthur Shaskelson did or Sidney Kentridge did. Johan won his cases because he was such a consummate advocate that got the facts that he wanted, persuaded the court to accept his version of the facts. That's a combination of cross-examination, skillful presentation of the case. But ultimately, Johan won his cases on the facts. And I find that with inexperienced advocates, and you can understand that advocates who are trained in law schools, where you learn from cases. In cases, the facts are given, and students then debate the law. And I can see that juniors, the moment we have a case, they hardly look at the facts. The moment they see the facts suggest something about a contract or a delict or whatever, they rush to the law report. Cases are normally won or lost on the facts, and therefore it's very important that they be given far more serious treatment than most of us initially do. Let's get to heads of argument in particular. Heads are, to my mind, heads are very important. There is a different school of thought. You know that there are some silks, some brilliant silks, who poo-poo heads. They sign off on whatever the junior puts before them because they don't regard heads as important. They go to the hearing, they prepare only for the hearing. They often do so brilliantly and they win their cases. But I believe that they can win even more cases had they put in more effort in their head. Let me tell you why I think that heads of argument are terribly important. 4 reasons. The first is that the heads first define the parameters of the debate. In other words, the heads identify the questions before the court. And often if you can persuade the court of your definition of the issues, the fight is half won. Because that is often where the trick lies, is to persuade the court that the question is the one that you've identified rather than that of your opponent. And that's what the heads do to a very large measure. The second is that the heads is your first opportunity at persuasion of the judge. And it is not uncommon for a judge to come into court having read the heads, at least prima facie persuaded of the one side of the case or not. So it's your first shot at persuasion, and sometimes your last, because your opponent may well persuade the judge on the heads. So important for that reason. The third is this, that the way in which our system works these days, the heads are really the first and last occasion in which you can comprehensively deal with the facts. In oral argument, one can always come back to particular limited issues of fact if there are important issues that one needs to address, one or two or three. But the facts generally, in other words, the picture that is painted for the court, the landscape in which the case occurs, the broad sweep of facts, can only be dealt with in the heads. You can't do it in oral argument. Reminds me of an advocate in Canada who tried to do it, Judge Binney, who was here, told us the story of how the advocate appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada on a contract case, a very long, very complicated contract. And he started reading the contract from clause 1. And when the Chief Justice realized that he was now proposes to read the whole contract to the court because he hadn't done so in his heads of argument, he said to him, Mr. So-and-so, you really don't need to read the contract to us. I can assure you we'll all read the contract. And he said, is that so? Will all the justices read the contract? They said, yes, we'll all read it. He said, well, let's read it together. But you won't have that opportunity. You can't deal comprehensively with the facts other than in your heads of argument. It's the one occasion where you can where you can systematically set out the heads and give them your perspective of the evidence. The fourth reason is this. Remember, after the hearing is over and the judges disperse to write their judgment, your heads of argument would be your memorial that the judge takes with her when she writes the judgment. And your heads must, in other words, also serve that purpose of facilitating a judgment in your favor rather than making it difficult for the judge to find for you. So I believe that the heads of argument are very important. How do you then, in your heads, persuade the judge? Well, I think the worst way of doing it is actually also, I think, probably the most common way for inexperienced advocates. And that is to say, here is a case, Judge, which is vaguely similar to the facts before the court, and it found X, and therefore you should also find X. That sort of argument by remote resemblance to some case is really a deadbeat argument and wouldn't get you anywhere. That is not the way to do it. Generally speaking, what one needs to do, as I said before, is firstly to make the judge want to find for you, and secondly to show her how to do so. What does one mean by persuading the judge to want to find for you? Well, our cases aren't like George's eviction case where you have mothers and children and grandmothers suffering cold. Our cases are normally far more mundane than that. But you can persuade a judge to want to find for you by showing that the outcome that you seek is the sensible one, or the fair one, or the common sense one, whereas your opponent's outcome is incongruous or unfair or irrational or whatever. So try to persuade the judge to want to find for you, firstly by showing that your outcome is a desirable one because it is fair or reasonable or sensible or common sense or whatever. And then go to the law to show how the judge can find it in your favor. When you make that argument, remember again, the purpose is to persuade. Be positive, be assertive in your argument. Don't be long-winded and boring. You might sometimes think that to be exhaustive is to be thorough, but long-winded arguments are boring, they don't persuade. If you can make a punchy argument by which you persuade the judge to want to find in your favor, then the other bits and pieces will fall in place. So that even if your argument is not a comprehensive one, if it is one that persuades, you'll win the case, even though you might not have been exhaustive in what you say. So the point is not to be thorough, as people from Pretoria might think. it is to be effective, be punchy, be persuasive, rather than exhaustive and boring. Because it is about persuasion and bringing across explanations and meaning that you want to convey to the judge, it is important, I believe, to structure your heads properly and sensibly. You can't really persuade people of your perspective without conveying your thoughts clearly and comprehensively, and that is best done in a structured way. These days, everybody knows one structures heads in chapters, and within a chapter in sections, and within a section in paragraphs. But structure it in a coherent and in a sensible way. Conclude with the orders that you seek. And then introduce a table of contents. I don't think that everybody realizes how important and useful a table of contents is for a set of heads of argument. It's important for a variety of reasons. The first, and often for me the most useful thing about the table of contents, after I had completed the heads and there is a table of contents, is that it gives me a bird's eye view of the structure of my argument. And it is not uncommon that when I look at the table of contents that I pick up a flaw in the structure of my argument. So it's a very useful tool for yourself to check the structure of your argument at the end of the day. It is secondly, for the same reason, a very useful introduction for the judge to your heads of argument, because it gives the judge a bird's eye view of the structure of the case. And then thirdly, remember, when the judge, after the case is over, takes your heads home with her to write the judgment, if she wants to know what is your argument on a particular topic, the table of contents makes it easy for the judge to know where to find your argument on any particular topic. So that table of contents is very useful, not only for the obvious reasons, but also for achieving your objective of persuading the judge. So much for the structure of the heads. There's another principle which I believe is important, and most of you would know and apply, but that is what I call the bottom line first principle. And that is, tell the judge where you're going with your argument. Don't keep them in suspense. Start off by saying, this is what I will argue, and then do it. There's nothing as irritating when you're a judge sitting up there to hear a long argument without knowing where it's going. If it is going to a destination of which you're already persuaded, well, then you can tell the advocate to stop it and go on to the next point or whatever. On the other hand, if it's aiming at a destination which is controversial, one would want to listen more carefully or read more carefully. So it's important to tell the judge up front where you're going so that they know what the relevance is of the things you're saying. And that is important not only in the heads as a whole. In other words, I'm not only saying that you should start off your heads by telling the court of the outline of your argument. It is also a principle which you should employ in every chapter and in every section of every chapter, so that having told the court in the beginning, this is what I'm going to argue, when you get to the particular chapter on the validity of the contract, you say, I now turn to the validity of the contract. I submit that it was valid because it was in writing or whatever. And then you make that argument so that the judge knows they read the first sentence. If they agree with the central proposition, the judge can skip to the next chapter. If they disagree, they'll read within just to see what your argument is. So, bottom line first, don't keep them in suspense. If we then turn to the particular chapters of your heads of argument, in accordance with the bottom line first principle, it is a good idea to have an an introductory chapter with an overview of your heads of argument. This is a very important introduction. It's not merely to ease the judge into your argument. It's a very important chapter because remember, this is where you lay the groundwork for the formulation of the debate, for drawing the battle lines, for the definition of the issue and dispute. So it isn't just a chapter in which you summarize what comes later. It is also a chapter in which you start by defining the issue before the court to your own advantage. You say what the case is about. You identify the issues in the case. You give your bottom line on those issues, and then you give a bit of a roadmap of where you're going. But it's important in this chapter to strike a balance between being too cryptic on the one hand, as to be meaningless, and too exhaustive on the other. This is not the body of your argument. This is merely the introduction to it. But to tell the judge, in essence, this is what the case is about. These are the issues. This is what I say on the issues, and let me tell you how I'm going to structure my submissions on it. There is then usually, in most cases, a chapter on the facts generally, the history of the matter. Now I know you fancy admin lawyers who go to court only to challenge the constitutional validity of a piece of legislation wouldn't know about facts. But most cases, other than those exotic cases, are about facts, and there's usually a lot of facts involved. So it is usually a good idea to then have a chapter on the facts generally. This is not the chapter in which you debate the hotly contested issues of fact. This is merely the chapter in which you give the general history of the case. And remember, this is what I said earlier. This is your first and your last opportunity to deal with the facts generally. So it's a terribly important chapter. And do not think that it is a neutral chapter. This is where you start persuading the judge. This is where you start persuading the judge to want to find for you. These are the facts that are meant to illustrate to the judge that the outcome that you seek is a just one, or a fair one, or a sensible one, or a common sense one, in any event better than the one your opponent seeks. Now, I'm not suggesting that you twist the facts. You obviously have to give a fair perspective of the facts. But there are normally 101 ways of interpreting the same evidence. And what this chapter does is to give the judge a fair account of the facts, but seen from your client's perspective, seen through their eyes. Very important chapter. Oh, and the way in which one gives the facts is to tell the story chronologically. There is the way in which magistrates, for instance, give an account of the evidence is to deal with the evidence witness by witness. That's because they keep notes as they go along, and then when they give their judgments and they summarize the evidence, they also page through the same book and they give the fact, they give the evidence witness by witness. That's completely useless. If you're a lawyer seeking to persuade, what you do is not to deal with the facts witness by witness, but with the chronology as things happen. People acted, people spoke, and a story evolved over time, so that the judge must end up with a good perception of the history of the matter. And also very important on the score, you need to reference your account of the facts in detail to the oral evidence, to the transcript, to the affidavits if you're on paper, and to the exhibits, and particularly the exhibits. An account of the facts without references is utterly useless. Judges don't pay any attention to it because you have no idea whether the account is an accurate one or not. So for your account of the facts to be the credible one, to be the one that the judge draws on in preparing a judgment, it has to be meticulously footnoted to the record. After the background is scene setting chapter there comes the chapters on the issues in the case. Now those issues may be issues of fact, they may be issues of law, they are more often than not issues of mixed fact and law. So I'm not suggesting that you can only have fact chapters and then law chapters. You sometimes have fact chapters, you sometimes have pure law chapters, but more often than not you will have chapters per issue which are mixed fact and law. So that if it's fact, you deal with pure fact, I'll come to that now. If it's law, you deal with the law. More often than not, you will say, and on this issue, on the validity of the contract, the facts are, and give a summary, this is the issue in dispute, and you then deal with the facts and you deal with the law on that issue. So when I speak of chapters on by issue, they remember that they may be chapters of pure fact, chapters of pure law, but more often than not a mixture of the two. Let's deal first with issues of fact. How do you deal with issues of fact? What would Johan Trengove do? Deal with it. Remember, this is now against the background of your general chapter that you had before, the general history. So you don't need to recount the general history. You don't need to locate your discussion of a particular issue. But you come to the particular issue, and you say, on this issue, the question is whether the parties agreed on the 27th of December to make a contract or whatever it is. And that is the issue. And you give the evidence of witness X, witness Y, and witness Z. So you present the evidence on the issue, and now comes the advocate's job, and that is to persuade the court that your witness's account of what happened at that meeting should be accepted. And there's a hierarchy of evidence that one can invoke in your favor. And juniors, inexperienced advocates often don't realize how they differ in weight. Let me explain. When you argue issues, contested issues of fact, there are the following kinds of evidence on which you may rely, and they differ very markedly in the weight they carry. The first is, and the far weightiest evidence, is contemporaneous documents before the court. Far, far weightier than anything else. In fact, more often than not these days, particularly in commercial cases where facts are heavily documented, people speak in writing these days. They speak by email and other forms of written communication. So, and those communications are generally preserved, generally disclosed, generally before the court. And frankly, in 80% of the commercial disputes of fact that I've been involved in, the documents tell the story, and pretty conclusively so. And anybody who advances an oral version at variance with the documents usually has a great uphill battle. So the first source of evidence on which to draw is the contemporaneous documents. Look at them very carefully and invoke them and show the court how your case is compatible with them or supported by them, and your opponent's case is in tension with them or contradicted by them or whatever. So contemporaneous documents is the first and most important category of evidence. Second is independent witnesses. And by independent witnesses, I mean truly independent witnesses. People who have shown, who are not aligned with any of the parties and have shown by their evidence that they are not aligned, partisan in any way. Their evidence carries much more weight than anybody else's. Third source to draw on, very important too, are the inherent probabilities of a case. Say to the court, it is true that you have these two versions, but look at the background history, look at the documents, and now look at these two versions. This version of your opponent is so improbable because people just don't act like that in these circumstances, where my client's version is makes very good sense. They were desperate to get a contract. Both sides wanted the contract. They came away from that meeting under the impression that they had one. The probability is overwhelming that they made a contract on that occasion. So inherent probabilities. Only in the fourth place does one get to the quality of the witnesses, the partisan witnesses. And again, inexperienced advocates often argue loudly and vociferously for the high quality, impeccable quality of their own witnesses and the poor quality of the other. It's a legitimate argument to say my witness was a better witness than his witness was. But it is not a particularly weighty argument, because one often knows that sometimes good and honest witnesses simply do not come across as assertive or as clever or as smart as others. So the quality of evidence is an argument, but it's not such a weighty argument. And then in the last place, if you're really desperate, there is the onus. But if you can't persuade the judge to find for you without getting to the onus, you're pretty far gone. But the onus at the end of the day, if it suits you, is something to invoke, and sometimes judges hate to admit that they actually don't know what happened, and therefore decide the case on the basis of the onus. So again, don't think that the onus is such a hot argument. It's very much a last resort. Because if a judge has to invoke the onus, it's an admission of defeat. They don't know what happened and therefore decide the case according to the onus. They sometimes do, but it's not a great argument. So much for issues of fact. Then for issues of law. First, the way not to do it, the way it's so often done, and that is to quote screeds of cases on trite issues that are not in point. You see lots of heads of inexperienced advocates. We have lots of law. The one topic on which inexperienced people often quote pages and pages and pages of cases is on interpretation of law or contracts or wills. You see, not only Malcolm Wallace's Natal judgment that everybody quotes, but pages and pages and pages of learning on interpretation, and having quoted it all the author leaves all of that behind and goes to the text and says it means X without invoking any of those principles that have been cited. So remember, the way to argue law is not to, and remember this too, some judges know some law. So you don't need to cite the very trite propositions to them. The Constitution is the supreme law. Freedom of expression is the lifeblood of democracy. All of that gives it. They really do know, and it doesn't advance your case at all. The way in which I would suggest one argues a point of law is this. I do believe that it is persuasive to start off by arguing on first principle. So establish what the principle is that you would say governs this issue of law. And again, you don't need to go on the principle on pages and pages of screed, but establish the principle. The principle is that the contract is interpreted to identify the intention of the parties, or the contract is made if there was consensus between the parties, or whatever the principle is. But find a principle, and cite one or two or three of the leading classical cases on that principle. And then, and that principle would normally be trite, but make sure that you identify the right principle which you say is the one that governs this case. And then tell the court, take that principle and apply it to the issue before the court. Say, look, here, when you apply that principle to these facts, this is the outcome that I'm seeking. And then the only other case you quote is the one that applied that principle to comparable facts in the way that you contend for. So that you end up not with lots of citations on lots of judgments about lots of irrelevant law. You cite cases only to establish the principle, you apply the principle to this case, and if you have the luxury that there is a case which has so applied the principle to similar facts, then you cite it. Because then you limit your citation of law, in other words, to those cases which actually contribute to the resolution of the issue before the court. If you take, for instance, come back to my pet topic of interpretation, 80% of our work is interpretation of laws, interpretation of contracts, interpretation of wills, etc. So, if you take interpretation, instead of all of those creeds about rules of interpretation, start with the language. We know that the courts have said you start any interpretation, start with language, and look at the language. What does the text say? I sometimes get drafts from juniors on interpretation. I really get the impression they haven't read the section. Never mind, pay meticulous attention to it. So if you're dealing with a proper interpretation of a provision, then read it carefully and start with the language and make a submission on what you say the language means. Very often, that is more or less the end of the debate, if you read the language carefully. Second is, look at the context. What do the surrounding provisions say? And with context, after context there is purpose, but often context and purpose hang together. Say to yourself, that's what the language seems to say. But look at what this act or this part of the act does. Look at the surrounding provisions. What can I infer from them? What is the work that is meant to be done by this provision? And how do I say, does my interpretation give effect to that purpose? In other words, do the work which the legislature obviously has in mind. So it's language, context, purpose, sometimes history, although sometimes not. But there isn't always a history which is relevant. And then lastly, and most important, not most important, but important, again, the sensibility of the outcome. What is Malcolm Wallace in that text that everybody always quotes, says that courts prefer a sensible outcome over one which is not sensible or not sensible. So that your interpretation is the one that is sensible. So rather than screeds of law on the field generally, which do not take the actual debate any further, cite the principle, apply the principle, cite the supporting case if you can, and by illustration, do it by resolving the issue rather than quoting vague law. And once you've done so, go home and write that feed.
Thank you very much. That was a real gold mine of advice and information. I did tease a tip of my own at the outset, and I think it was just a drafting tip, but I think it really ties into what you were saying about the presentation of facts. And I'd done some heads of argument where I was prefacing a lot of my statements with the words, things like, the evidence shows that A, B, C, D, and Kate told me, and I believe that you told her once, that just by deleting those kind of phrases, your facts and your submissions come across in a much more direct and much more punchy manner. So that's something that has helped me. But I'm sure there are lots of questions. Can we have a few minutes to take some questions?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
I've got two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is to what extent do you deal with your opponent's case, and where and how do you do it? And the second question is, there are a lot of considerations. How do you then consider all of this and then still keep your heads concise?
Well, your first question is a very good one. And in fact, I've dealt with a set of heads in the last 2 weeks from a very, very smart and clever junior, two juniors in fact, who were very, very clever and thorough, and for that reason dealt with all of our opponent's arguments. But for strategic reasons, I deleted all of that, because I think that one should be driven by your number one priority, and how do I persuade the judge? And it just seems to me in that case that the argument became too much of a boring harangue if I dealt with all of my opponent's arguments. So what I did was to confine the argument to the main thrust of why we say we should win, in the hope that if I persuade the judge that I should win, that those other bits and pieces will fall by the wayside. The exception to the rule, so that I generally don't recite my opponent's arguments, and I generally don't I deal with them specifically. The exception to the rule is where my opponent makes a fool of herself, and if there is a manifest flaw in the argument, which is visible and obvious, then I might exploit that by saying this is what they argue, but it is obviously wrong. But those debatable issues where there is something to be said for the opponent, as there usually will be, I rather leave out. I do sometimes incorporate my counter-argument in the argument that I put forth, but I don't think it's productive to say to the court, my opponent argues this and my counter-argument is why. I'd rather put up argument why if it's an important issue without reciting the opponent's argument. How to keep it concise? I won't claim that my heads are especially concise, but I do try to keep them as concise as possible. And I think that one can do so best by cutting out all of the bump that doesn't take the argument forward. In other words, all of the screeds of law about freedom of expression is the lifeblood of democracy, and that sort of hot air. So my point is not so much that cryptic heads are better than developed heads. My point is just that you lose persuasion when you start boring the reader. So keep it as punchy and concise as possible, but there's no reason not to argue fully.
So on that point then, is there a guideline? What would you say is too much or too little? Is there like can you be guided by how many pages or how many words?
There's an advocate in Pretoria who's sometimes controversial, but a very clever guy called Nick Moritz. His heads of argument are sometimes 2 or 3 pages, when everybody else weighs in with 40 pages. And he's very successful. He has the confidence to pick a point, and he makes just that point, and he stands or falls by it. So I'm not suggesting that there is a right way and a wrong way. All I can say is, and let me say, I've been in cases where the issues have just been so massive that my heads have been 80 pages or something. So I can't give you a number, but what I can say is that generally speaking, punchy and interesting is more persuasive than long-winded and boring. The moment you become long-winded and boring, judges stop reading your heads of argument. They're uninteresting. If you read Edwin Cameron's prose, I don't always agree with what he says, but the way in which he says it is often quite a nice illustration. of how things can be said in an attractive and compelling way. Any other questions?
So from the perspective of a junior who is presenting you with heads and they want to give you all the counter arguments that you can do, is it better to leave this in for your benefit, or would you prefer it that was all out? And
No, absolutely. It's probably a good idea to put them in so that I can decide whether to keep them in as is or just to turn it into an aspect that we argue or something that we take out of it altogether. So, no, I'm not suggesting that the junior's draft should be as bare as mine might ultimately be.
I mean, I'm trying to get from your experience. Can one ever overcome major flaws either in your pleadings or in your evidence through your heads? Can you actually turn a case around based on that?
Yes, by distracting attention from it. And remember, that's where framing the debate, identifying the issues, that is the work done by that part of the argument. And quite often by persuading the court, and sometimes even your opponent, that the issue is one thing, you move away from an issue on which you might otherwise have been flawed or fatally flawed. So, that also goes to another issue which has got nothing to do with heads of argument, but with oral argument, presentation of argument. It's something that comes up with a question you asked, but also you, and that is, what do you do in reply? In your replying, in your oral argument in reply. And I think that the reply is very important because it is important to come away to persuade the court when you leave them that you should win. It is a good idea if there are arguments of your opponent that you can destroy in reply, and if you can, by all means do it. But a fatal flaw in reply is to raise an argument against you, to draw attention to it, and then fail to destroy it, because then you really seal your fate. So in the same way, I would suggest in heads of argument, if there is a real flaw in your case, then try and get away from it. The worst thing that you can do is don't think that it's always better to do your best on it, because sometimes it just draws the case onto that issue, and it's obvious for all to see how poor you are on that issue, rather than try and shift the issue somewhere else than on the issue on which you're poor.
Sorry. How do you avoid duplicating what you've written in your affidavit or in your application in your head? So sometimes you find that you've got a very clear-cut case that you made out in your founding affidavit, and you get tempted in drafting heads to want to kind of duplicate what you've already said in your affidavit.
I assume that judges will read my heads, but not necessarily my affidavit. And I would rather put my best foot forward in the heads, whether it's also in the affidavit or not. And remember, judges can be pretty disinterested in your argument. And if you're going to say to them in your heads, on this issue, please go and read my affidavits, etc., very often they would just not bother to go there. So I think make your best case in your heads, whether it's been made in your affidavit or not. Sometimes when there's an issue which is really boring, you might say in your heads, this is the essence of it. The full version, if you want it, is there in the heads. So I'm not suggesting you should never cross-refer, but don't assume that the judge is actually going to read the argument. Yeah.
Can you tell us about the legendary Dear Vim letter and what purpose it serves for you?
Well, like everybody, I like to be loved. No, what I mean by dear Bim, I often say to juniors, don't do a draft of the opinion or the heads or something, because I know from experience that a hell of a lot of effort goes into writing up the heads. So, and that effort would be wasted if we are not agreed on the way in which the final product should be structured. So what I mean by do me a dear Bim letter, I mean go and work up the case and then write me a letter, an informal letter that says this is what the case is about, this is what I think the answer is, and this is how I suggest we go about it. So that it's an informal, easy to write message to me. That also then helps me that I don't then have to work up the case before having a meaningful conversation about it. The letter then helps me to see what the case is about, see whether I agree with the junior, and then we have a discussion. And then I ask the junior to go ahead and prepare the heads or prepare the opinion along agreed lines. So it's a way of avoiding a wasted effort in a final product before we've decided what it should say. And if you say, if you like me, it's even better.
How does your argument, the structure of your argument change much between the heads of argument and the oral argument?
Yeah. Well, let me say this, because I take heads seriously, and the heads are therefore my best shot at the argument. There is a far greater correlation between my heads and my oral argument than there is with the other school of Silk, who signs off on the juniors' heads for whatever it says and then makes her own argument when the time comes. So there is a greater correlation in my case. But there are many things which can only be effectively done in heads and not in oral argument. For instance, my chapter on the overview of the facts, the history, I would never go back, I would never in oral argument try to even convey all of that. Sometimes where the facts are important, I might start off by saying go to paragraph 77, I just want to emphasize this fact or that fact. So I wouldn't I wouldn't traverse that laying of the groundwork. And then for the rest, I would normally assume, depending on which court one is in and who the judge is, normally assume that they've read my heads and merely emphasize the features which I believe are crucial to the case. Normally the features which I think are those that sink the opponent. So they are features of the heads, but not the complete heads. But that it does also depend on whether I believe that the judge has read the heads. That's not always so. It's usually so, but not always. I would be more comprehensive if I get the impression that the judge hasn't read the heads. Anything else?
One last question.
Yeah.
What happens in, not related to heads, but just something that I've always thought of as a dynamic where people like yourself and people more senior appear before judges who are of junior experience to yourselves?
Yeah.
And the likelihood that somebody of your seniority, take for instance the Chief Justice. I've done the chronology. You took Silk, I think was it 89?
87.
87. The Chief Justice was doing pupillage in 93, 94. So where you've got people on the bench who are likely to even develop self-doubt from being bombarded with things they've never heard from senior counsel.
Yeah.
How does one navigate that dynamic?
Yeah.
God forbid I'm against you, because it will never happen. But I'm just saying, where you've got that your opponent has a stronger sense of persuasion against the judge, just by virtue of who he is or the level of experience that they carry versus yourself. And you now trying to persuade the judge to see things your way, and the judge is thinking, Matelezi, you're too junior to make these arguments. I can't be persuaded by you.
Well, you know that Chief Justice Pius Langa and Deputy Chief Justice Mosineki were both my juniors in their day. But that doesn't necessarily help. Yeah, I mean, it might be counterproductive. I might just hate my guts for it. Because so no, it is different if you start appearing before people who are your peers or even your juniors. But you know, we're all pros. We treat the people on the bench as judges, not as seniors or juniors or whatever. And people of the caliber that we're talking about are, you know, the best of the best. So it's very easy to show respect for them. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you once more for giving us your time and giving us such a helpful, practical and thoughtful session. Thank you.
Thanks.